Live. Okay, so welcome everyone to the 150th episode of History Matters. Who knew? Someone asked me this last week, like, when you started this, did you imagine you'd have more than, I don't know, 2 months, 3 months? It's like, I actually never thought about it. I was just like, we just started the pandemic. What can I do when people are all like trapped at home? Actually, I was talking to, it was Peter Onuf, I think I was describing this to, and I saw like Lin-Manuel Miranda was putting up music that didn't make it into his musicals, and Yo-Yo Ma was playing music, and who was it? Someone else was reading sonnets. Anyway, I was like, well, what can I do? What can I do? It's like, well, this is what I can do. I could do this. I can offer history once a week for people, and these are weird times, and I will do that. And then, lo and behold,
yeah, and it's much appreciated by many, many, many people.
Well, likewise, right back at you, people who are being appreciative. Okay, so here on our 150th, see, I didn't have to ask Carol Lee for once, like, what's the number of the episode? We are going to be dealing with the question, is this the worst it's ever been? I'll explain why that came up after we get through our introductory portion here. But, oh, there it is. Patrick Stewart, Nancy, yes, was the one who was reading sonnets. Before we begin, I will turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History, and as always, delighted to be with you every Friday. We have our 150th anniversary show today, so I'm expecting lots of great questions. Joanne will
always have great questions.
We do, but today's special, so you guys need to bring it. So today, Joanne will talk for about 30 minutes. For those of you who are new, this is how it works. Joanne will talk about 30 minutes, and then I will check the Q&A. So that's where you need to put your questions. We already have one in there. And at 10:30, we will start the Q&A portion, and then we will wrap up right around 11, and then Joanne will explain what happens after that. So please put questions in the Q&A.
In suspense.
The chat's going to go on and on, but we will look at the Q&A for your best questions. All right, see you in a little bit.
Thank you, Annie. Keep it family friendly. And also, if you are here for the first time, please say in chat that you are here for the first time, and the wonderful History Matters community, which truly is a community, will welcome you. Somewhere floating around out there is a map of all the places where History Matters people come from, or a map in formation. Because we have people from all over the world, which I still can't quite get my mind around. 3 years into this whole Zoom-tastic time that we live in, it still amazes me that I can sit in a small studio apartment and talk to the world. So that's one plus. Okay, so is this the worst it's ever been? The reason that topic came up is because I did a Zoom event yesterday, not public, so otherwise I would have told people it was out there. But Drew Faust and I were asked to compare the 1850s to the present, and how does that comparison work, and how does that comparison not work? And it was an interesting conversation. And of course, in one way or another, again and again, the question kept coming back. So is this worse? Is this worse? Is it worse? Well, it was worse, right? That was much worse. That constantly we were framing things and comparing things and measuring things. And it ended up being more part of the conversation than I had anticipated. Maybe silly of me to assume it wouldn't be. Anyway, that's what gave me the idea for today's topic. Is it the worst it's ever been? Now, if given many of you have been here for 150 episodes, you may remember something that I must have said at some point before. We're now at the point in History Matters where, like with my seminars, particularly my undergraduate seminars, where I have like certain stories that I like to tell, and I've been teaching those courses for 20 whatever years, and now I just can't remember when I've told the story already. Like, I gotta tell you this story, and if I told it already, just smile. I'm at that point. with this too. But certainly it is a point that I make with my students, and that is, if you are writing a history essay of some kind, making a historical observation of some kind, you want to be really careful using words like first, only, unique, worst, right? Those kinds of words in some ways are more subjective than they need to be. And speaking from experience, when you make that kind of statement, someone will always appear and prove you wrong. So rarely is anything that you think is the best or the worst or the first or the last or whatever. Those are always dangerous comments to make when you're thinking historically. So I preface what I'm saying this morning with that observation. But that said, I do want to talk about specifically some ways in which our times may or may not be the worst ever. Now, there are two words in that statement that need to be unpacked a little bit, and one is ever. And that one I hadn't thought about it beforehand, but when I posted this topic on whatever 500 social media platforms I'm on at the moment, several people responded and said, well, it's the worst I've ever seen. You know, it's the worst in my lifetime. It's the worst since the 1960s. It's the worst. So ever, logically, ever can be during my lifetime. It's the worst it's ever been. I totally understand that. Or in my, immediate sort of historical memory, or from what I know about recent history. There's a lot of evers. My ever, our ever, the History Matters ever, of course, is looking more broadly than that, but important to think about that word. Another word that isn't in this question, but that someone asked me again on one of the 500 social media platforms I'm on, they said, that's a really great question, but I have one right back at you. Worst for who? That's an important question. That's a really important question. And I didn't include it in the question, but I think any question like this, even if you take out the worst and talk about, is this a particularly bad time? Even then, obviously, some people are having an easier time of this moment, and some people are having a far worse time of this moment. So that is an important part of this, not in the question, but has to be considered, and perhaps some ways we might address it when we get to the Q&A portion. So ever needs to be defined. I'm defining it broadly. And the other word, of course, is worst. If we're using it and not being entirely historically careful, is it the worst it's ever been? What does that mean? Of course, that can mean a lot of different things too. And that came up yesterday in my conversation. It was before the Council for Foreign Relations, I believe, that we kept being asked, like, well, the 1790s newspapers, those were worse, right? Those were the worst. Those were the worst. Like all of the horrible things that were in the 1790s newspapers. And I had two answers to that, and Drew Faust had many answers as well. But one of my answers was, okay, first off, objectivity was not, I said not on the radar screen. And then I said, of course, there are no radar screens in the 1790s, but objectivity was not a standard for news at that time. So if you're looking at 1790s newspapers and saying, wow, they're full of lies. Well, yeah, but that in some ways was a norm, right? So to me, that means it's not, I can't say it's the worst it's ever been, because nobody was expecting much better, right? So that's kind of a random measurement, the worst it's ever been. And since then, of course, there have been any number of other bad newspaper times. What matters, of course, is in the context of the time, how are people measuring things? So in the 1790s, they might have been very upset at newspapers. From our standard of measurement, not so much. But, we'll talk a little bit about violence later on. If we're talking about times that are more or less violent, really important to consider how violent were the times and how much violence was accepted. All of these things matter, right? If you want to sort of step back, way far back, objectively speaking, and say, if we're looking at the number of times people threatened violence now versus 1858, I suppose, first of all, how do you measure that? But let's say magically you could, and that's not going to tell you very much, because the historical context is going to be so different. So anyway, ever and worse, have to be contextualized in some way. Okay, so I've been asked this question forever. I was asked this question even before my most recent book came out. People knew that I was working on congressional violence, and anything that happened that was remotely nasty or threatened violence, there would be some media outlet that would be like, not only did they want to ask me if it's the worst it's ever been, they wanted me to say, they really wanted me to say, well, this is the worst it's ever been. And I frustrated countless people by refusing to say that, in part because I didn't necessarily believe it, and in part for all of the contextual reasons that we're talking about this morning. So let's delve in a little bit. The worst it's ever been. Is this, and I have a series of things here that one might lump under the category worst. I'm sure you can think of others. We can talk about them during the question period in, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes from now. But let's talk specifics. Are we living in the most polarized times in American history? That's one definite measure of worst. And certainly it's something that we're seeing to an extreme degree now. Someone said, yesterday, like the Chinese balloon became partisan in a nanosecond, right? No matter what happens. Someone said yesterday, like ice cream, right? Ice cream will be partisan. Just M&Ms are already partisan. So everything is being made partisan, high degree of polarization right now. Connected with that, again, I talked about this yesterday, two really different visions of what the United States should be, and an inability for some to compromise in any way on that, to engage in conversation in any way. A lot of this has to do with identity and emotion, which we've talked about a lot over the course of the last 149 episodes. But at any rate, highly, highly polarized. Would I say it's the most polarized we have ever been? No. Now I'm going to come back to this at the end, because there are some ways in which I'm going to say maybe not worse, but way up there. But at any rate, is this the most polarized we've been? No. And of course, the contender that throws itself into every conversation about is this the worst it's ever been is the Civil War. So how can you say that we had a civil war in which Americans were slaughtering Americans, in which many, 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 many people were killed? There was widespread destruction. Even just looking at a war, how can you say things are worse now? The Civil War, things are more polarized. There have been moments when we've been hyper polarized in the past. And certainly the issue of slavery is one that polarized people. Yeah, there were attempts to compromise on the issue of slavery, the series of compromises, right? The compromise of 1820, compromise of 1850. People kept trying to come up with ways to compromise the issue of slavery. I don't think that was a very compromisable issue in many ways. Hard to imagine that being successfully compromised and the nation remaining one. But regardless of what one thinks about that, highly polarized times. And I would say, in a different way, but in the 1790s, really different views of how democratic, small d, the nation should be, and extreme emotion, extreme charges, people willing to go to extreme lengths to protect what they thought was right and to destroy what they thought was wrong. They didn't have a sense in the 1790s of, two-party system, loyal opposition. They just thought we and our friends are thinking about what's best for the nation, and they are thinking only about themselves, and they're going to destroy it. So that's a different mode of politics. So we've had many, many polarized times before. Are we hyper-polarized now? Yes. Has culture become polarized? Has religion become polarized? Many, many, many things have become polarized, and I'll add to that, politicized. That's another thing that happens in polarized times, is that things that normally wouldn't be political, like say M&Ms, actually, or Mr. Potato Head, think back to Mr. Potato Head, things that might not be politicized at all suddenly get yanked into the polarized times we're in. Culture war is the phrase that people throw around. I kind of don't like that phrase because it makes it sound like some kind of concrete thing when I think it's more amorphous and dangerous than that in a way. But at any rate, that's an issue for another day. Not the most polarized times, although I put an asterisk by this. We'll come back to that again. Are these the most violent times we've lived in? No, right? I mean, on January 6th, the original January 6th, people were talking about, this is the worst, the most violent. Again, that was a moment when everyone wanted every historian to say worst. And the word unprecedented floated all over the airwaves. And there were aspects of January 6th that were unprecedented. But the violence, some people actually said this degree of violence in American politics is unprecedented. Oh, wait, no. We have a long tradition of infusing our politics with violence, with threats, with campaigns, and the target varies, right? So you had anti-immigrant violence during elections in the first half of the 19th century. You always have violence of one sort or another against people of color, and particularly Black Americans, right? Our politics has always been infused with violence in one way or another, and that ebbs and flows, and the nature of the violence ebbs and flows. So again, context would be, I should have written it on my forehead. Context matters to all of the generalizations we're talking about today. But is it the most violent? No. Nor is it certainly not the most violent time in Congress, as this book would remind us. So despite the fact that we see all kinds of threats and people getting people to resign from school boards or from being workers, election workers, all libraries, all of these people that are being threatened and are stepping down, all of that is horrible. All of that is extreme. All of that is sustained and deliberate. But I wouldn't necessarily say it's the worst. It's really bad. And I'm coming back to this at the end too. Don't know if I'd say it's the worst. Are we seeing the worst violations of voting rights? No, right? No way you can say that. Looking at America's past, even just looking at the point when most Americans could vote, when women had the vote, when Black Americans had the vote, even if you move that recently in time, there was a reason for the Voting Rights Act. There was a reason for that, and that is there have been all kinds of violations of voting rights. Now we're seeing again, not just violations, but some of what's I don't know, what do I want to say? Particularly threatening, I guess, is the sense of a campaign or a sustained effort or organization in some way, again, that is not unique to this moment, but is worth talking about in this moment. But so not the most polarized, not the most violent, not the worst infusion of politics with violence, not the worst violation of voting rights. Are we living in the most racist times? We're living in racist times, but is it the most racist times in American history? How you measure that, I don't know. But unfortunately, I would say we've been pretty heavily racist for most of our history. The question is, how does that display? Who displays that? How are the victims of that racism dealt with in some way, comforted in some way, protected by the law in some way? All of those things vary. But as much as we're looking at a lot of white supremacism these days, and a lot of not just entrenched, but politicized and organized in a way that is suggesting it's going to be part of the system. Again, coming back to this at the end, we're seeing a lot of that now. But despite the fact that some people in Florida might not want children to learn about racism or race in America's past, conflicts over race, it's there. It's there throughout. And the only way to understand our current moment is, of course, as so many of you who are here and who are teachers know, you have to study history to understand how we got here. It's not even, I would say, in my list of not the most, it's not even the most fascist time in American history, if you're using that measurement. And I went back to look. I remember at some point maybe it was backstory or something, that the 1920s, there's an NPR episode called When Nazis Took Manhattan. And it's about a huge rally in Madison Square Garden in the 1920s. And at that effort also, there were like Nazi summer camps, and there were a variety of ways in which Nazism was everywhere. I would highly recommend finding the NPR When Nazis Took Manhattan. There's footage, there's film, or at least audio of that 1920s rally, which is totally worth finding. And I think it's something that not a lot of people know about. But so the most fascist time, no. Has democracy been endangered before? Obviously, yes. Which brings us to what I keep threatening to come back around at. And that is, what's distinctive about this moment, if not unique? And this is something I've talked about before, we've talked about before. All of these things, polarization, violence, infusion of politics with violence, voting rights, racism, fascism, democracy under attack. We've seen them all. One of the distinctive things, if not unique things we're looking at now, is insiders with power, with political power. And here's how I wrote this on my piece of paper: who seem to lack some commitment to democratic institutions of government. I'm very diplomatic. There are some insiders on a national or state level who do not seem particularly attached to the democratic process, democratic institutions of government, who are willing to erode or attack things like presidential elections that shouldn't be eroded and attacked. And we're watching on the state level all the time, right? State legislatures, secretaries of state, governors, whoever, trying to find ways in one way or another to cut back on voting rights, right? We're seeing this happen in one way or another. It's not attacking democracy that's new. And I wouldn't even necessarily say it's not people with power attacking democracy that's new. What is not necessarily new, but distinctive about this moment is the degree to which it's people within the system who in some ways have power has been denied them, and in some ways power has been given to them, that people within the system have a degree of power and are openly expressing sentiments. They may or may not act on them, I don't know. But that's something that at least is distinctive about this moment. It's not all of the sentiments, all of the negativity, all of the violence. It's who has power with that, all of these things, who actually has some control over the political process or what's going on in the nation, and the degree to which there's an open and sustained attack on various levers of democracy in one way or another. So, is it the worst we've ever been in? I still say no. These are the most dangerous times we've ever lived in. I also say no. Again, even if you're looking at race, there have been worse times. But if you're talking about a sort of insider sustained threat to democracy, not necessarily the worst, but mighty noteworthy, like really, really worth noting and worth doing what we've talked about countless times here, which is watching for that, watching to see what's happening, watching to see the rhetoric that's being used, watching to see what that rhetoric is intended to make you think or do, watching what the insiders are saying and doing, and those are not necessarily the same things, but really, since that's where some of this threat, and on a state level and on a national level, that's at least where there's a lot of polarized threat, we need to keep our eyes on those things. Not the worst, not necessarily unique, but ranking up there as far as a moment when there's an extreme threat against democracy coming not just from the outside, but from the inside. See, now the siren went off because the fates somehow agree with me. At any rate, so is it the worst? I'm going to disappoint all of those media outlets by saying, I'm not going to say it's the worst, but does that mean democracy isn't under threat in some ways and that we are not living in dangerous times when we have to be alert to what's going on around us. No, all of that is true too. So in some ways, it's the measurement process that's the problem here. It doesn't have to be the worst, the most, the only, for it to be threatening and bad and worth being alert and reckoning with and grappling with. And if there's one theme that we've had through all 150 episodes of History Matters, that's one of them, which is being alert, thinking about what people are saying, thinking about the impact it's having on you and do people want you to have that impact, watching what people are doing versus what they're saying. Again and again and again, we've talked about all of the many ways in which we need to stand ready to see threats to democracy and to defend democracy from threats, to call things out when we see them, to organize or protest, any of the number of ways in which we can prevent, the frog in boiling water phenomenon and keep calling out what we're seeing, naming it for what it is, and forcing it into the light in one way or another. It's not the only thing we can do, but in one way or another, that's an ongoing threat and an ongoing duty, I think, of any American citizen, is to always be willing to stand up for democracy. Democracy meaning government by the many, diverse nation with government open to all citizens, democracy defined broadly and not democracy defined as I get my rights and you're not guaranteed any. That's not democracy by a definition that I would necessarily agree with. Okay. I see I'm 1 minute past our time. I'm going to stop. I am going to show you the mug. I didn't even see the mug. Oh, thank you, guys. And you will tell me if I've used this before. It will be apparent. Oops. It will be apparent if there's anyone here who is new. For 150 weeks, I have brought forward a mug at the end of every episode to somehow or in one way or another linking with the topic at hand. I do not have 150 mugs. This mug.
Oh, I don't remember that one. I
don't think I've used it. It's been in the back. Be good to yourself. It's a new one. Woohoo! It has all kinds of things on it. Ask for help, relax, feel deeply, reach out. So I don't think we should necessarily abandon worry, which is one of the things here. But
push yourselves.
I think yes. I think given everything that I just said and the kinds of times that we're in, I think it's important to remember to also be good to yourself so that you can help others.
I promise I did not know you were going to say that. I literally last night was working on my next newsletter that I send out to teachers periodically. And it had a whole section in an article I linked in there about teacher self-care and teacher burnout.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
It's like you're a mind reader, Joanne.
I am. I read your mind, Annie. Before we go into the questions, I do want to say one thing that I saw. I try very hard not to look at the bottom of the screen where I see people's conversation. I did see Gloria say, I think, that I was misrepresenting Florida's education policy. And I didn't want to let that go. And someone can tell me if that's what I saw or if I imagined it. One of the things that I think is true about Florida's policy is that on the one hand, they are trimming away a lot of things about race, slavery, and racism that they don't want taught. But a key part of that is not defining precisely what the offense is remaining amorphous and ambiguous about what's not allowed. And what that does, so on the one hand, you could say, they're not saying you can't talk about race. That's okay. But if you're a teacher in Florida, you're going to be thinking really hard about what you're teaching and what books are in your classroom. So that's a more accurate way of explaining what I was saying. But I didn't want to seem like I'm throwing something out there, throwing a missile, as one of my politicians would call it, and not addressing it. So, okay.
We've got tons of questions today. I don't know if we'll get through all these, but I'm going to go ahead and do my very best to field them to you. This first one comes from our friend Ryan. It says, are things like they are now more than they have ever been? That's attributed to Eisenhower.
Are things, read the quote to me again. Are
Are
things now?
things like they are now more than they have ever been? I guess that's a quote attributed to Eisenhower. He wanted you to comment on.
Wow. Are things like they are now more than they've ever been? I mean, I suppose I would say no. I suppose you could argue, if you wanted to argue, the combination of things right now is pretty distinctive. So I don't know. The extreme polarization, the attack on democracy, and the worldwide pandemic. It's kind of a triple whammy, right? We live in times that have, what's the cliche? The perfect storm of crises. We've had other pandemics. We've had all of this has happened before. Has it happened in this precise way at one particular moment? Maybe not. But that's as far as I will go with that statement. And someone got also, if there are folks who are new here, people play bingo because I'm so predictable in some of the words that I will use, which now makes me think about every single word that comes out of my mouth. But if you come back, which I hope you will, you'll be able to play bingo next time along with everybody else. I'm sorry, go ahead with questions.
One new person this week. We have a new Dave.
Yay!
A couple of other Daves who are regulars. So now we have multiple Beths and Daves today. Okay.
Welcome, new Dave. Okay.
Here's a question from our good friend Cece. She says, if 1790s news reporting was biased and full of lies, when did it change? Maybe there was an event or a series of events where news reporting shifted to more truth and reporting. Do you know if in the long run that has come and gone many times, different time periods?
Well, certainly I would say in the period that I'm studied most intensely, it's a slow rise, right? Because initially there are newspapers that are trade oriented or business oriented and talk about shipping and goods and things like that. And then there are political newspapers, and the political newspapers are the ones that typically they're created by a partisan alliance. I like to use rather than party, but let's, for sloppiness sake, party. They're created by a party. They're a party organ, and members, like highfalutin, powerful members of one faction or party, come together and put money in and hire an editor, and that's their newspaper. And that's their, if you are doing any study in any newspapers from this period and on well into the 19th century, you really have to know the politics of the paper to read it and understand it. Which I always tell my students, you have to go and look it up. Is it a Federalist or a Republican newspaper, a Democratic or a Whig newspaper? I would say that later, when you're sort of moving ahead into the 19th century, that still, you're getting crazy claims in the press when you have steam-powered printing presses and railroads and telegraph, when you can spread news with greater speed. That encourages many people to be less accurate. It's like, boom, we can say everything we want and it'll get out there fast. And then you see a lot of, I saw a lot of 19th century newspapers, 1850s it would be. And on the front page of the newspaper, there would be one column and it would be headlined telegraphic, right? Because it's like, wow, it's the telegraph. But often what you would see is, telegraphic. So-and-so has challenged so-and-so to a duel in a house. And then the next day it's like telegraphic. Yeah, no.
Now that makes me want to get back into the Valley of the Shadow archive and just search for the word telegraph and see how many, and I'm going to do that.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting that they're so excited that the news can spread that fast and they're tripping over themselves. But at any rate, it's a slow process. I would say there have been points where it's actually been valued, valued more maybe in the mid and late 19th century for some press outlets than it was before. Standards of objectivity sort of came into play at some point in the 20th century. And we are in a moment where I don't know what the standards are, but I think they're being challenged in many ways, she said diplomatically. I would say we are at a moment when we all have a sense that objectivity is not being valued. But in a way, as in some past eras, we're not entirely sure what to do about that or what we should be watching or reading, or, in some way, when you're talking about objectivity in the press, you're talking about reality, the version of reality that is passing before you. And other people have talked about this to a great degree, right? We are in a moment now where what is reality, because no two people necessarily can agree on it for technological as well as political reasons. So anyway, that's a very long answer to say slow process. It's been better. And in some ways now it's worse.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I just posted all the references to the word telegraph from the Valley of the Shadow. So I'm going to play with that later.
Yeah. Woo.
Yeah, right. Okay, our really good friend Kathleen V is back, and she asks, she says the US earned 83 out of 100 possible points this year in Freedom House's annual ranking of freedoms around the world, an 11-point drop from its ranking of 94 a decade ago. The US's new ranking places it on par with countries like Panama, Romania, and Croatia, and behind countries such as Argentina and Mongolia. It lagged far behind countries like the UK, Chile, Costa Rica, and Slovakia. That's not really a question. It's more of a statement, but would you like to comment on that ranking, Joanne? Maybe?
Yeah, well, that's a pretty remarkable statement. Yeah. And that actually gets back to a question I addressed at some point in my comments, which is measurement, right? So if you're measuring, and it might have a statement there about what specific things they're observing and measuring, but I'm assuming standing far back and looking at, like, I don't know, elections being challenged. I don't know what is, freedom is being, how it's being defined. I'm pausing only to see, Andy, if it says something, but go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to put the question in the chat for Tim and Kathleen to maybe give us a link to the whole study, because I feel like we sort of need to see the whole thing.
Sure. Before
data, you can make data say almost anything you want it to say, right? That
is very true. Very true. I would say whatever the data says about America's ranking, it's obvious that in some ways democracy is under attack, not just in the United States, but in many places around the world. And that's the moment we're in. How the United States, the attack on democracy in the United States ranks with attacks in other countries, that I don't know. And it would be interesting to see this data and to think about it. How many bazillion times have we seen someone point to something going on in another country and say, is this America or is this the other country? Or something going on here, a photograph of it, and then someone saying, how would you describe this if it was in another country? Meaning, if it was in another country, you would say it's mob violence, it's an attack on democracy. And in the United States, people just kind of, oh, it's okay, it'll all be good, it'll all be fine. So as far as the standard, I don't know, but I do think the larger point is worth stating, which is in many ways, democracy is under attack around the world, and that's the moment we're in, and we need to know that that's the moment we're in. I have a friend, I had a dinner with a friend. I'm guessing maybe Trump had been elected, maybe. It was a friend I hadn't seen forever, maybe since high school. And we were having dinner, and he said, and I still remember it all of these years later, he's the same age as me, obviously, from high school. And he said, did you ever think about the fact that maybe that we were lucky enough to live in a moment of time when certain democratic standards were actually stable, and that now they won't be again, and they weren't necessarily before? Like, did we look at a couple of decades in there when things were kind of particularly good and we took it for granted that they'd always be that way, and that's just because of when we were born? Which is kind of a really grim way of thinking about it, but I do think it's true. That gets back to where I started, worst, right? We measure things based on what we've seen in our lifetime. And that measurement, although it's not absolute, it matters. If you can say, if I can say in 60 years, I've never seen X before. Yesterday with Drew Faust, I think I'm a little younger than her. We both were like, well, in our lifetimes, we never thought X, Y, and Z would be threatened. So is it the worst? No, but that's something that we never would have imagined for the time that we're in.
Yeah. It reminds me a little bit of did you ever go to the museum? It was a museum in DC about the news. The brick and mortar museum no longer exists, but they still have the front page website with all the newspapers. But they used to have a wall that had a giant map. You know how I think in maps, and it showed where there was free press, like which countries around the world had a free press. And it was, to me, it was the most striking, that, and then they had the wall of journalists that were killed in the line of duty, trying to report, from dangerous places around the world. To me, those were the two most important exhibits. And that free press map, it just makes me wonder now, like if they still had that museum, how would our press be rated? Because they would rank it degrees of, they could report some things and not others. And it just always fascinated me, and it made me in the past think we were so lucky, despite all our differences, to be able to live in a country where we still had a pretty open, and we always were among the top rankings. But now
sure.
Kathleen's, contribution this morning, I wonder if we still had that, would we still be?
It was a good museum, and if we needed it at any time, now is the moment when we need it for reasons like that, just to see visually some of the things that we're talking about in a general way here. I do want to make the point, I was just saying, maybe we lived in this good couple of decades among many that are not bad. I don't want to say that without the who sort of, qualification thrown in. That may be true. I'm also speaking as a white middle class woman, so that statement might sound different or be different depending on who is making that kind of a statement.
Yeah. All right. We have a question from Pauline. She says, please elaborate some ways these are the best of times, for example, medical advances, understanding mental illness, ease of communication, access to knowledge, etc.
Oh, that's excellent.
I love that. Thanks, Pauline.
And I think, excuse me, I think some of the things that you've said are true. Regardless of whatever people are saying about vaccines, we're in a period of amazing progress in science, in medicine. I think that still remains true. I think, again, advances in communication have complicated things, but we've also made incredible advances in communication. And I always hate saying, the positives about the pandemic, it's a horrible statement to make, but the fact that it taught us all of the ways in which we can communicate with each other around the world, and I mean, that, it makes me think of when personal computers first came into existence, and I just couldn't imagine, like, why does anyone need a computer, right? Why do we need a computer? Like, I would never shop online. I want to see things in my hands. This kind of makes me think of that it's like, I wouldn't have imagined if you, 10 years ago, you could sit at your computer and talk to people around the world. I was like, yeah, sure, whatever. And it's going to be weird. It's going to be technical and, blah, blah, blah. So that's amazing. And that has much good that comes of it, in addition to some of the complications that come from it. Medicine, people who can get access to doctors in ways that they might not otherwise be able to, the cultural benefits of that kind of communication, all kinds of things are positive that come from that. What else would I say is positive? Well, I actually talked about, this is recent, but it is positive, this yesterday, and that is, I think, there is more of a sense of activism, political activism, say in the last 8 years or something, recent times, that people are more active in politics, that they're stepping forward, young people particularly. Again, it's related to some not so great things, but it's a really, really encouraging and good thing. It's one of the things I cling to when my students indicate their interest or their actions, and I think, okay, like these undergraduates, they're getting in the mix because they understand that it's needed. I think that's a plus too. So you're totally right. There are many, many pluses. Maybe I should have, today's episode, since it's the 150th, maybe I should have said, are these the best of time? No, actually, there's no way you could ask that. But at any rate, yeah, I'm just catching up on what people are saying. I don't know why people are talking about WordPerfect.
You were talking about the computers and how people like.
Got it.
They're all coming on old school tech they started off on, yeah.
And related, actually, I see Tim is talking about the digital public library.
Yes.
Databases. Holy smoke. Databases. Access to knowledge. In all kinds of different ways. Just again, in my little window of time, between starting grad school and now, I had to go to the library and bring these big volumes down and thumb through them, and and now I can be like boop boop boop. And there are negatives to that, and this might be an interesting thing to talk about on another occasion. A friend of mine, a historian friend of mine, talks about what he calls database books, and by that he means people who go to a database and punch in something. How many times is this said in this period, and then draw conclusions? Like, well, you can totally see that, and there's no context. It's just a database book. And this was years ago that this friend of mine was like, we're going to see database books, and it's going to be a problem because the context is not going to be, the conclusions aren't going to be coming really from context. And there are some database books, which I will not name, floating around out there. So, you, with every benefit, you then have to sort of process and think about and figure out the responsible way to use it and the irresponsible way to use it, and the ways in which it can help and the ways in which it can complicate.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, our good friend Gloria has a great question, and she's been so kind because I was having trouble piecing it together. So she was so kind enough to retype it for me. So thank you, Gloria, for your patience. She asked, is there such a thing as too much democracy? Is that what the threat is, and not the democracy itself that's being threatened? Ooh, a deep one.
Well, some of the founders would have said there's too much democracy. Federalists were really not particularly comfortable with democracy. And I'm not even talking about race or gender. I'm talking about just average Americans. But even the Republicans were not totally comfortable with democracy. And that's why they were talking about demagogues so often in creating the American Republic, because in their mind, that's a given that in a democratic mode of government, someone's going to milk the public for whatever they can get from them and pander to them and give them what they want and then grab power and do with it whatever they want. And that's a vulnerability of a democratic mode of government. I don't know, I would also say the degree to which, going back to like 9/11, we suddenly realized that like people could come into this country and train, have flight training here, and then use that training to crash planes into buildings, that those people could be here, they could be welcomed here, they could be educated here. It's not as though we're going to somehow filter people out again. Another vulnerability of democracy. I think there are vulnerabilities, but those vulnerabilities are part of what makes it great, which is it's reactive to us. We make it, right? It's not absolute. It's not dictatorial. It's malleable in some ways. It reflects us in some ways. It can be changed. People who have power can be taken away from them. It's the vulnerability and the flexibility and the sort of amorphous spaces where positive change can happen. That's some of the good of democracy. So I wouldn't say too much democracy. I don't, and that's a measurement I don't know how to make. I don't know when you have too much democracy. And again, for who has too much democracy and who doesn't have enough? And I think those things can happen at the same time and kind of are. But I think being aware of what, I talked about this yesterday too, being aware of what democracy actually is and what it can do and what it allows for in a positive and negative way, that's crucially important. And the degree to which I think a lot of Americans fundamentally don't know what democracy is a huge and ongoing problem.
Yeah. All right. So I don't know if Tom is trying to trick us with this question, Joanne. I think he's trying to trick us into getting him bingo. But it's a good question, so I'm going to go ahead and let him do it. Okay.
Okay.
So we might just be helping Tom win bingo here, but I think it's an interesting question. He said, where does Joanne put the Watergate Saga of 73 to 74 on the spectrum of worst or most divided?
Again, I have a problem with worse, but I would say what was what was one of the noteworthy things about that was the degree to which it was publicized. It was put on TV, it was covered by the media, and it opened the eyes of many Americans to something that they hadn't necessarily been thinking about before. So I'd say, obviously it was corruption, and it was corruption exposed. Is there other corruption that has not been exposed and that perhaps was equal to or not, or worse than that? Yes. But as far as a spectrum goes, this actually might be a way in which it's better rather than worse. And that is that people understood it. I don't have the figures, facts and figures in front of me, but at some point in preparing for some podcast somewhere, I actually had figures about the degree to which people's understanding of and opinions about Watergate, bingo, I have no idea, how people's opinions about it dramatically changed once there were televised hearings that they were watching. It had a huge impact on people's political views about the government, about Nixon, about any number of other things. So that was an important kind of awakening moment, I think, for some Americans about government and how it worked in a way that they were watching people testify. So it wasn't just people standing up and saying corruption, which has been going back to the beginning of the nation. It was testimony, and it was people were watching for themselves the giving of the testimony.
Yeah. When I was a kid, I think I've told you this story. My grandma watched soap operas. And then when Watergate started, of course, everything was 24/7 news coverage. And especially in the afternoon, those hearings went on and on and on. And we would come home and we thought that she was still watching soap operas. And we were like, why has these soap operas gotten so boring? Nobody's kissing, nobody's slapping each other across the face. Like,
no one's wearing a doctor's outfit,
right? Talking, and we couldn't figure out why the soap operas weren't sexy anymore. And finally one day I said, where's Erica Kane or something like that? And my grandmother said, Anne, this isn't the soap opera. This is real life. Like, our country is falling
Erica Kane,
apart.
that's All My Children, right?
Yeah, that was her story. She called them her stories.
Her stories, right? My mom
the bus, right? We would get off the bus next door.
Yeah.
She lived next door to us, and we would get cookies, before we went home, because mom wouldn't give us cookies, but grandma would. But anyway, I thought Watergate was the soap opera because it was, 3:30 in the afternoon. But that's how I figured out, like, that was my first connection to government, I think. Was, so this is not a soap opera.
It's not a soap opera. And yet in some ways it is, but yes.
Yeah. Well, yeah, then we got sucked into the whole like breaking into a building and that sort of thing. All right. Tim, our good friend Tim, who finds us many links, asked, did the founders or those in the early 19th century have anything to say about moral panic?
Well, they certainly had a lot to say about morality, right? And related to that, religion. So, go back to the founding. Did people feel that morality was important in a small r Republican form of government? Oh, yeah. They talked about it all the time. And that almost gets back to talking about democracy. They knew that in a small r Republican form of government, which is a democratic mode of government as it was created here, my brain just turned right off. What was the question again?
Did the founders in the early 19th century have anything to say about
morality? Yes. So they felt that morality, thank you. Boy, that was like bing. They felt like morality was particularly important in a republic because the people had so much power. They actually were believers in freedom of religion, and they didn't want state-controlled religion. So despite the fact that some people would really like that to be true of the founding era, it wasn't. But they did see morality defined very broadly as something that was important in education for similar reasons. Vitally important, because the public needed to be educated and to understand how their country worked and what threats to it would look like. So I think all of that is true. And I think also you might say the great sort of reformist movements, the temperance and even early abolitionist movements. There's a great moment in time when I think some of these great social change movements certainly have a morality aspect to them. So I think morality, particularly in our mode of government from the very beginning has been talked about. I think because it gets yoked in with religion, it can be made more concrete, or it can be yoked to different purposes than from what it was necessarily intended to be by some.
Yeah, people were commenting in the chat about all the religious themed Super Bowl ads this year. That there was.
Oh, I did not watch the Super Bowl, but I heard that there were many Christian ads.
I didn't watch it either. My nephew every year texts me before the halftime show so I can watch the singing. That's our deal. So I only watch.
Tom, thank you for saying that. Yes, every once in a while that happens, and normally that happens like in public. I was in England, and I was like, there are 3 reasons for this, and I got through 2, and then it was like, yeah, I got nothing.
Carolee and the other teachers, we've all experienced that in front of students, and the kids usually think it's hilarious, and they'll usually get you back on track. Oh, you were about to say this, that's what it's
like. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay, we have a couple more questions, but it is 11, so it's up to you.
Let's try. We'll see how long I'll try to be short in my answers.
Okay. This one comes from our friend Bobby Nintz, and she says, do you think we Americans are capable of learning from history, or are we just ignoring it? Gosh, I hope we are.
Are we capable? Yes, of learning from it. Are we always learning from it? No. Do we assume that somehow history repeats, and so learning from the past means, oh, it happened this way, it'll happen exactly this way again? I think to some degree people think that, and that's wrong. Talked about this yesterday too. History doesn't repeat. As a historian, you look for patterns, and then your knowledge of those patterns, you can apply that knowledge to what's happening now. But learning from history doesn't mean looking for a prediction about exactly what will happen next. It means looking for patterns to understand this country and how we got to where we are, and how patterns have played out in the past, and what that kind of information can tell us about what's going to happen going forward. So it's in part, I would say, should we? Yes. Are we? Some of us are sometimes, and more of us should be, but I'm saying I'm preaching to the choir on this one. Yeah, I think learning about American history is one of the main ways in which we can hope for change to come, because it will enable people to see that things are different over time, things change over time, and that we can make change, right? How did we get here? What train of things led us to get here? And simple fact that we can make historic change in perhaps a new way.
Yeah. Okay, we have one from Debbie Pomerantz. She says, granted that things are not the worst today, the question I have is how much progress is it reasonable to expect over time?
Oh gosh, I have no answer to that. I personally, I think I hope for the best and expect not the best. There could be, sometimes progress can happen quickly. Now, that said, sometimes progress can happen quickly, and then there's a backlash, right? So I do think, generally speaking, change isn't magical presto. It takes place slowly, and that's important to think about, because I think sometimes people don't see instant change and they feel that nothing is happening. Doesn't mean we should all sit back and be like, yes, well, things are going to change eventually. But I do think it can be a victory to begin to institute change, even if you're not getting the full amount of change that you want, as long as you are supporting people to keep that effort going.
All right, people just keep adding questions. I don't think we have time. There's like 5 or 6 more. So
no, I can't do 6, I think.
Yeah, I know.
But that's great. Look at you guys.
I know, right? We've got some, because it's the 150th anniversary show, they all brought it. Has language become more extreme than actual actions? That's a short one from Ryan.
Repeat that for me.
Language become more extreme than actual actions?
No, I mean, I think there's been, a lot of extreme language over time, and even more extreme violence. And I think there's been the same weird imbalance, and people's willingness to speak a lot more violently than to act. And we've talked about before the power of the threat, right? The way that people bully people into abiding by what they say is by making big threats. And as long as it's credible, as long as people believe you might carry it out, that's power. People will censor themselves, will sit down and shut up. So I don't know if I'd say it's a new thing that there's more threatening language than there are threatening actions, because I think there's a great power to threatening language deployed strategically. And I think that's always been the case.
Yeah. Okay. Ryan had a follow-up question. With the availability of social media, are vocal minorities who formerly never had a voice that was heard given more credit than they deserve?
Well, certainly one of the ways in which social media has complicated things has been who is speaking and how they're speaking and how often they're speaking and how wide they reach and everything else. But I would say something that I noticed off the cuff when there were my first Zoom meetings or Zoom events, speaking as a woman, is that in this kind of context, women have a louder voice because it's not based on a room and people being loud and big and waving their hands around. I found that it was more balanced in a sense. Social media, Zoom and such things could be more balanced because there's one way for people to get into a conversation. So yeah, I do think that means lots of people are on and communicating and saying weird things. And I don't think we have yet grappled with what that means or how or if or when it should be regulated in some way. But that gets back to the earlier question. I don't think it's only negative for more people to have a voice. Since it's already 6 after, let's have one more question.
Okay. I'm going to give this last one to Dale. I'm sorry, Dave. Dave had 2 good questions in there, but Dale asked, we've talked about accountability often. During any of the worst of times that you cited today, was there ever any evidence of accountability to the people involved?
Well, sometimes, yeah, I mean, I can sit here and point to moments when it didn't happen. Right? Those are the moments you pay attention to. But sometimes people with power are held accountable. If that never happened, we wouldn't actually be in a democracy. We wouldn't have a democratic mode of government of any kind, right? Accountability really is the heart of the democratic process. If you give power to people, they have to be accountable for how they use that power, accountable to you. And sometimes people have been, and sometimes they haven't. Watergate, interesting moment. We were just talking about something being exposed. There was some accountability being enforced in some ways. So, and we could sit here and easily name lots of moments, many of them recent, but going all the way back, when no, people have not been held accountable at all. I do think we're living in a time of crisis of accountability, when no one wants to be accountable for anything. And everyone's walking around saying rights, but they're talking about rights in a way that the founders never intended it. Maybe we talk about this sometime, but the founders, when they were talking about the Bill of Rights, it was they were thinking about Americans as citizens having rights as a group from the government. They weren't thinking about individuals like, I personally have this right. That evolved over time. But I'll stop here because now we're at 8 minutes after.
Yeah, we are.
This is maybe the longest we've gone with the questions. Those were great questions.
It's our anniversary.
Pardon?
I said it's our 150th anniversry. We deserve it.
Look at that. Okay, let me explain what is going to happen next. So we are now going to segue to the after party. What that means is that we will no longer be recording. We will have I always say the camera off. It's like that would be boring. We will stop recording so that we could be even freer and easier in our conversation and talk about whatever the heck we want to talk about. If you are watching us on Facebook, you will need to leave Facebook to join the after party. So leave Facebook and go to ncheteach.org/conversations, ncheteach.org/conversations. And you will be able to beam right into the after party. I know I didn't say poof. Normally what I say is you can go and join us at ncheteach.org facebook.com/conversations, and poof, you will be in the after party too. I can't miss that on the 150th episode.
Yeah, we got to say poof. It's our tagline.
It is poof. So at any rate, I hope many of you will stay. If you're not staying, I hope we will see you next week. I do want to thank you, as I always do, this week and 149 other weeks, for engaging in the conversation of democracy as we do, asking big questions, thinking about big topics, addressing questions that very often have something to do with democracy, which are questions that need to be addressed in a big way right now. So we may be a small community, but we're a community that matters, like any community in this particular moment. It matters. The communities are coming together and having these conversations and thinking about the times that we're in and how to respond to them, and the fact that we can affect change. So thank you all for being here for 150 now weeks. And thank Annie and thank John for being here ever and always. And actually Matt out there, Matt Messias, who, was the initial Annie, my initial partner in crime, for all of the things that you guys do to make this possible. It's a team effort in the biggest of big ways.
Yeah,
So,
I think Matt was
and
the one
Grace, yes, I don't want to forget Grace.
Yeah, and Grace. I think Matt was the one that added the jazz hands, kind of the poof. When you said poof, he did this the first time, and then we all
Jazz hands was what he did when I got emotional.
Oh, that's right.
When I got teary or upset, he would be like, jazz hands, jazz hands.
I thought about him so much this week when everything happened in Michigan and that terrifying evening with the kids on campus. And I couldn't remember what campus Matt worked on. And so then I was like Googling it really quickly to make sure that wasn't our Matt.
Okay, let's segue to.
All right. Got to turn the recording off, John.